In today's About Books, we welcome Alan Cowsill, an old friend from my Marvel Comics days. Alan's career has taken him from scriptwriter and editor to compiler of some of the biggest encyclopedias on superheroes. Alan Cowsill, my old friends.
How are you doing?
I'm doing. We met many years ago when we were both working at Marvel Comics. Since then, you've gone on, and these days, one of the many things you're known for is as your encyclopedic knowledge of all things superheroic. So many wonderful books filling people in on who did what, from the 1930s all the way through to the present day in these massive volumes. We'll come to those in a minute. But to begin with, I want to take you back even further to what I consider to be one of the most extraordinary graphic novels I've ever read. And that's your World War One book. Absolutely wonderful telling of that story. It captures the overview of the whole thing, but it also does it in a very intimate way. You feel you're there, and you're seeing it through the eyes of real people. For me, this is a book that should be in every single school on the planet. Can you tell us a little bit about how the book came about, and how you came to write it?
Yeah, well, my good friend Jason Quinn, who's I think a relation to you, was working for Campfire Publishing in India, and they were starting a new line of books, history books mostly, and the first one was going to be about the First World War. The original idea was just to do quite a cold history of the war, but between us we decided it needed a hook. I'd always been interested in my family history, especially my dad's great uncle Fred Cowsill. He was one of those poor guys who was 15, signed up underage and died in action. I thought it'd be a perfect chance to tell his story and combine it with like history of the war. But to get the real horror of the war across, you need to root it in the reality of the people who fought. So I used real people, like Fred's experience. He died at the Battle of Hooge in 1915. Your own grandfather, I think, Davy Fletcher, who was a pilot, who apparently got sent to the front after punching his CO.
He was court-martialed.
Court-martialed?
Yes. Well, I'm very proud of that fact. His superior officer, I believe he broke the nose of him. And I feel his blood raging in my veins to this day. So it was a delight to see his story popping up in your book.
Well, he became friends in the book with my own great uncle Peter Ullman, who also fought in the war.
Yeah.
And Paul Peter had the misfortune of being there when there was a gas attack. It's only a passing moment in the book, but I want to get the whole of the gas attacks across. And Peter was one of the few survivors of his company because the gas hit them. Peter fell, luckily. His friend's bodies covered him and created an air pocket for him. And he survived, but all his friends died of the gas attack. So I want to include that story as well, and did a lot of research to include a lot of real people's stories in the book and cover all the main battles, but not just cover the battles from a factual perspective, because we all know, countless people died in the First World War, but if you view the war through the eyes of the soldiers, it takes on a whole new meaning. Not just the Somme, but things like Passchendaele, which was just probably one of the most horrific battles of the war. We had like layers of mud and water and people just drowning as they were trying to fight.
Did it change your view of the war? I mean, all the research you did, or
yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, obviously, we all know it was a savage war, but the more you look into it, the more you realise not just how truly horrific it was, but it gives you a newfound respect for the people who fought in it. the teenagers. That's my Uncle Fred, 15 years old. Going
Do you know why he signed up? Because I mean, he needn't have.
It'd have been
He's 15.
patriotism.
Yeah.
There was a massive rush of patriotism across the country because we'd all been led to believe that the Germans were bad.
Well, where did that patriotism come from?
It was imperialism at the time, from all our parts,
media,
not just England. And there is you could have some argument that the Germans were the aggressors.
Yeah.
I mean, they did want their own empire at the time, but every country knew it wanted their empire. So there is that, but patriotism always does it. And we all got wrapped up in it, caught up in it. And, within 2 years, they weren't quite as patriotic.
No. And indeed, luckily, it was the war to end all wars.
Well, that was it. There was never war again after that, and everyone lived happily ever after.
Yeah.
So that was good.
So how did that come about? I mean, it was known as the war to end all wars during the war, was it?
Yeah. Well, everyone thought it was, but at the time, you've got to remember it's obviously 100 years ago, but it was really still, to all intents and purposes, the end of the 19th century. So you had all the big sort of intricacies of diplomacy, like England, France, the alliance system at the time, just meant that one little thing happened. It was like a domino effect, and suddenly the whole of Europe was at war. And obviously Princip, the assassin, was the bullet that the whole world heard when he shot Archduke Ferdinand.
So that was the thing that kicked the war off.
That was it. But even now, it's almost like a modern day conspiracy, because Princip and the other assassins who were with him were being under the pay of the Serbian government, who wanted a greater Serbia. And that movement is then what triggered all the wars, all the alliances, and then brought everyone into the war, including sort of Russia and everyone else.
It doesn't really make any sense, does it? Or is that just me?
It doesn't to normal people, but at the time, at the time, it was, and you could almost see it as well from the working class being sent to the front to die, while the rich people made money out of it. So a lot of people became millionaires selling arms, building arms, at that time.
There are 100 stories that you tell in that book, at the very least, and I always felt myself well versed in World War One through my grandfather's eyes and the stories he was telling me when I was growing up in the 50s. But I learned so much. Any one story in particular leap out at you as?
Yeah, one of the things that amazed me when I was researching it, partly because it was for an Indian company, so I felt we should show a wider view, because we have a history of the war that we just see as the Somme a lot of the time, and that's the horror of the Somme is all you see. You never hear about the greater one. But the role of the Indian Army was vital in the early days of the First World War. They were professional soldiers sent over to the front line in their sort of summer Indian gear and spent sort of the first 6 months of the war defending the line against the Germans, when our first range of soldiers had been devastated, and they pretty much saved the war for England and the Allies. If it wasn't for the Indian Army, the Germans could well have won the war in 1914, 1915. But we never hear that.
Looking back now, since you wrote the book, how do you think World War One is viewed in the present day by kids growing up today? We always said, lest they forget. I mean, they talk a lot about that with World War Two, but World War One was equally horrific, without a doubt. Do you think people are forgetting? Do you think the next generation will have completely forgotten?
I think there is at the moment, both the First and the Second World War. You can almost see what's happening in Europe at the moment, like even just, should we be in or out of Europe? Europe came about, the European system at the moment, because of the Second World War, and to keep peace, and people are forgetting that now. So it's in danger of fragmenting a bit. I think also the problem with the First World War, it was so complex and so bloody, and there was no real good or bad. Whereas the Second World War, it's very easy, there was the good guys and the Nazis.
It was comic book
exactly,
style, wasn't it?
It was perfect storytelling.
Yeah.
But the First World War was far more complex, because the Germans weren't really at fault. Their soldiers were just trying to fight, as well, as much as the British soldiers. So it's harder to have a clearly defined right or wrong in the First World War. But I think over the last couple of years, actually, with the anniversary coming up, there's been a really good attempt to bring it back to people's consciousness.
Yeah.
And I think that's important, obviously.
Yeah. Well, I was invited into one school to create a magazine to, in the words of the head teacher, celebrate World War One, which threw me a little.
Yeah. There's so much to celebrate. You know.
Or I should say, through that blood raging through my veins of my grandfather.
Yeah.
You know, the thought of the word celebration being attached to it. All the more reason I feel why this book should definitely be in every school library, assuming the school has got a library, which it must have. You mentioned Campfire graphic novels. Not the world's most famous comic publishing company at the moment, but very interesting company for all that. Can you tell us about it a little?
Yeah, they're based in Delhi, and they release mostly graphic novels. A lot of them are adaptations of great novels like Dracula. Jason Quinn did a great biography of Mother Teresa and Gandhi, so they do a lot of educational stuff more than history books. They've also done some great work on Indian myths that read like a Marvel version of Thor or something like that. What I think is amazing about them, the quality of the artists, like Lalit Sharma, the artist for this book, they're as good as any American artist, but they're still unknown. And my theory is that the last 10-15 years in comics there's been a massive influx of Spanish artists, partly down to Marvel UK 20 years ago. But I think the next big wave is going to be from India. And some of their artists are going to take like mainstream Marvel and DC by storm and become megastars.
Is there any downside to working with Indian artists, especially on a book like World War One? Did they get the references instantly?
I sent them a lot of reference.
Right.
Tons.
Yeah.
Years ago I worked with a great British editor and writer, Pat Mills, who did a comic called Toxic. I was lucky enough when I was starting out to meet him a few times. And the way he works is he doesn't just write a script, because his stuff's obviously historically based. He did Charlie's War, which is, to this day probably the greatest British World War One story. But he sends his artists tons of reference. And I was kind of inspired by that, so I wanted to make sure that every panel or every page came with like a dozen images and quotes or pulling from old papers and reference books and stuff.
Yeah, certainly flicking through the pages of World War One, boy, you feel you're there.
Yeah.
I mean, you feel the mud and the blood and the thunder going on over your head. An extraordinary work. Let me take you back to the day we met, long ago.
Yeah.
There we were, Marvel Comics, and Marvel had an office in London, very nice place. On the Thames. And Marvel UK at that point were doing extraordinary work, weren't they? There was a lot of money being pumped into them from the US. Can you tell us a little bit about those times?
Yeah, it was amazing. We had it was like a new wave of the British invasion of America.
How would that come about? Do you know?
It was basically Paul Neary and some of the Marvel editors at the time. They'd done a few superhero comics tentatively. Marvel UK was mostly known for sort of reprinting, repackaging the American comics. People of our age might know Mighty World of Marvel, things like that in the 70s was the first things that they came across.
So it was reprinting.
It was reprint mostly.
US stuff in a UK format, wasn't it?
But then in the
Weekly.
70s they did try Captain Britain, the first real British Marvel hero. And again in the 80s they did a few attempts to do American-sized comics, and they did okay. But by the late 80s, early 90s, comics were becoming amazingly popular. And Marvel UK did a comic called Deathhead with Dan Abnett and Ian Sharp sort of created it. Deathhead 2, I should say. There had been another Deathhead before that was
more
equally
comedic.
successful, more comedic.
Yeah.
Deathhead 2 was comedic, it was just darker and more violent.
Yeah.
But both Deathheads were successful. But Death Head 2 came out and was like a revelation, something like 500,000 copies in the first issue.
So this work was being created in the UK
Yeah.
and sent into the US.
Yeah,
Now that was a first, was it not? At
it
that
was.
point?
Never been done before.
Yeah.
And so once Death Head 2 was so successful, obviously they needed more books, and the line just expanded. Probably too quickly.
Overnight,
in retrospect.
if I remember
it went
correctly.
from like 2 books to about 40, and
Yeah.
at times editors like myself have been summoned into the MD's office.
So you were an editor at that point?
Yeah, I was an assistant at first.
What were you working on?
Overkill, the British reprint title of the American editions, and then a lot of the American versions, Multimouth, Kill Power. It was quite a violent time. It was the 90s, most characters had big guns and shot people a lot.
And had the word death in their
and
title.
had the word death. Death did really well. In the
Yeah,
90s.
how many death comics were there?
This is like a test, isn't it? There's Death Head, Death Head 2, I'm sure.
Was there a death guard?
There was a Dark Guard.
A dark guard, okay.
One of the
Okay, so-
jobs I had at the time,
Was
one
it-
afternoon with a mate of mine, Glenn Dakin, who's
Yeah.
another great writer at that time. Our boss told us to actually come up with the net heroes with the word death in. that
Death
Marvel
Wreck.
appeared. Death Wreck, that was a good one.
Deaf old git. Oh, that doesn't count. No.
We did come up with Death Kill, but that never saw print.
Okay.
I did a comic called Death Duty
Right.
that never quite made it.
Yes.
But it did actually get printed, just never hit the shops because the old market had collapsed by then.
I believe you've written a book. You've written a proper book.
Yeah, I've written
as we call it.
I've gone and written a novel.
Tell us about that.
Well, it's called Punch Drunk Kisses, and the idea is I want to do something different. I've wrote a few kids' books before. Did a one in the 90s called Colin the Goblin. It's like a nice little adventure book for kids and a few others. But I wanted to go in uncharted waters and do a book set in a small northern town, not like my own town. And it's basically still about that age in your mid-20s where you're a bit lost and you're not sure what you're doing with your life and you're trying to find out, mostly by drinking too much and making all the big mistakes you made.
Is this based on somebody close to
I
home?
appreciate it's not based on anything I've ever done
Or St.
anyone
Helens?
I ever know, or St. Helens.
No, okay.
No.
We'll get that clear.
Get out of the
up
way.
front.
No, it's purely fiction, obviously.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Is it set in a particular time period?
It's set in the present day.
Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to make it sort of relevant to now.
Yeah.
But I think most people I know go through this strange time in the 20s or late 20s where they're a bit detached from themselves, the world. They're not sure what they're doing. And it's about a group of people trying to find a way through life and work out what's going on. And experiencing loss while also, hopefully, there's a few jokes in there.
You've obviously written many scripts for comic books. How was it making that leap to writing?
It's different, it's
A
good.
novel.
It's
Did it come naturally? Was it?
I find ideas come differently. Comic book ideas come as comics, or ideas come as novels or short stories. I don't often find that I change one to the other. So, like a few years ago, we did a comic for Marvel called Revolutionary War, and that couldn't be in any other way. That was just a good old superhero story. But when you write a novel, it's a different approach because you're on your own for a start. So there's no one to help you or anything, and you're telling the story yourself, you're painting a picture yourself. The characters are yours. Whereas in comics, it's a bit more like writing a play, and the actors are the artists and stuff. So it's more of a team effort when you write a comic. It's your story, but the artist adds his side to things and the visual side.
Do you allow the artist that freedom, or
Yeah.
do you not have the choice?
No, I think the best comics.
Or are you happy for them to have that freedom?
Ideally, I like working with artists I know.
Yeah.
So you've already got a working relationship with them. For instance, John Ross I've worked with for years on Action Man, started off writing Action Man stories together. We did Spider-Man stories for the UK back in the day. Did Colin the Goblin together and a few other things. And he's someone I write a script, send it to John, and the art comes back and he's added things or nothing to destroy my story. It makes it even better.
Yeah.
And ideally, I think that's when it works, the process, when you're working off
Teamwork.
each other
Real
to make
teamwork.
it
Yeah.
better.
Yeah. What else? Well, I mean, you've done so much. We lost touch with each other for a few years. Boy, you were busy during those times. I mean, you've worked on practically everything. Everything I haven't worked on, you've been in.
Yeah, well, we
Just
started.
about.
Yeah,
What stands out through your career, looking back now at this time of autobiographies, as we reached that period of our lives when we can cast an eye back?
I like the World War One book.
Yeah.
I'm very proud of that. Interesting thing, it won a few awards in India last year, which was great.
It won an award.
It won 3.
I'm not surprised at all.
What was funny about that was I couldn't make it to Bangalore for the comic book convention where it was up for an award. But we knew when the award ceremony was going on. So Lalit, the artist, phoned me up from India. He couldn't make it to Bangalore. He was in the office in Delhi.
Yeah.
A marketing guy from Campfire was at the award ceremony.
Right.
Phoning Lalit in the office in Delhi
Right.
to see if we'd won. And he had another phone in his hand, live to me in my flat. It was about 10 o'clock on a rainy Saturday morning. And I'm getting this line coming from Bangalore saying, I think you've won something.
Yeah.
I think you might have won. No, you've won something. We're not sure what. Oh, you've won 3 awards, and we found out one best writer, best artist, and best graphic novel.
Amazing.
Which was brilliant. And
so
that was strange, though.
Space age way to find out. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It was
space age, but not as we know it, Jim.
Yeah.
You know.
And the other thing actually was great. A few years ago, I got involved in a charity book called The Spirit of Hope. More in my role as editor.
Right.
It was to raise money for the Japanese flood victims when there was the tragedy of the tsunami a few years ago. And that went from trying to do a little comic, about 20 pages with a handful of comic creators. So many people got involved, it ended up being, I think it's 120 creators.
Really? Can you name some of the names that you got brought in?
Liam Sharp, Pete Hogan, Glenn Dakin, David Leitch. It was a who's who of like British comics, you know.
I knew David Leitch when he was David
great.
Leitch.
In fact, we bought, thanks to that charity book, one of these great characters, Psycho Gran, came back. It went over well, and he started doing it again for Titan Publishing now.
So a real mix
Yeah.
of stories and storytelling in that book.
Yeah.
What else? Where do you go next from here?
A bit of both. I like mixing editing and writing, because writing is great, especially if you're writing novels. It's quite a lonely occupation because you're there on your own with these strange characters you're creating. So as well as the proper, punch-drunk kisses, I'm working on a children's book called The Skull Crew. That's more of a fantasy. About halfway through that at the moment. You
say fantasy Skull Crew. Can I get any?
Yeah, it's kind of a sort of post-apocalypse future. Slightly, I want to do something that's kind of humorous adventure. In a post-apocalypse future, in a world controlled by demons, I want some characters that.
So Death's Head lives on.
Death's Head lives on. I want to take that cynical view of the world and give it to all.
You really are from St Helens, aren't you?
I am.
Yes.
Part of it is I was inspired as a kid by Action, 2000 AD, comics like that. Way too violent for 8-year-olds like me.
Well, that explains a lot, doesn't it? If you were raised on comics like that, this is what you get.
Exactly.
Alan Cowsill, thank you as ever. A delight. Good luck. I can't wait to read the book, the novel, and see what you bring out next. Wonderful work. Thank you.
Cheers.